Hey there, everybody. So I apologize for the technical difficulties, but we are live finally. And we're going to be going over today where the fairy tales went wrong. All these Disney princesses that we love so much. I don't know about you, but I was raised on Disney and I absolutely love those old fairy tales. But if you notice, they all had one thing in common. These princesses had lost their mothers. Those moms were nowhere in the picture. And if you think about it, all the magical intervention like genies and magical contracts with sea witches and kind of like sketchy things that went on in some of these Disney movies, none of that would have been necessary if those moms had planned ahead and had a real estate plan. So I thought it might be kind of fun if we went and did a little training today on what would actually have happened if these moms had a real financial advisor and an attorney who could advise them on what they needed to have in place to protect their kids. So for those of you who don't know, my name is Sarah Nicole Nadler. I am the founder and CEO of Fierce Feminine Finance. And not only do we offer financial services, including life insurance and estate planning, etc., but we also have a pretty fantastic blog, if I do say so myself. And last Friday, as I was prepping our blog for this week, I was given a fit of inspiration about the Disney angle of estate planning. So we're going to have some fun today and talk about 3 different Disney princesses and what were their biggest mistakes, or rather their mother's biggest mistake. So let's start with Snow White's mom. Biggest mistake, letting a minor inherit your wealth. Think about that for a second. What have we all been taught, right? We do not put our minor children as the beneficiary of our estate plan, of our life insurance, right? It's a big no-no to have a minor inherit their money. So go ahead and let me know in the chat if this is something that you have thought of. Who is going to be the beneficiary of your wealth, of any investments you have, of your business, of your life insurance policy? If you have minor children, there needs to be a designated adult who would be responsible if something happened. All right, so we took a look at that. Let's take a look at what actually happened in this story. So Snow White's mom, as far as we can tell, she passed away in childbirth, but it's not fully clear in the books by the Brothers Grimm or in the movie. But we kind of are assuming that she passed away at childbirth because Snow White is pretty young when things kick off in this movie, right? Now, her mom clearly died without a will, a trust, or even a scroll tucked under her pillow to let everybody know what was supposed to happen. She left behind a baby and a man who quickly hopped into a toxic relationship with a gold digger, right? If you look at that wicked witch who inherited all of Snow White's kingdom and all of her wealth, what could we have done to avoid that? Right? This whole let's hope for the best approach basically handed Snow White's future over to this power-hungry stepmom who had a flair for the dramatic and a deep resentment of her daughter's facial symmetry. Definitely a toxic situation. And because as a minor she couldn't inherit, that left the witch running the whole estate because she ended up, I think she offed her husband. I think that's what really happened. So all conspiracy theories aside, what should have happened there, right? Let's take a look at the real consequences in real life when something like this happens. Here's where she went wrong. Trusting her husband not to remarry. That's probably not going to work out for most women, right? Most of the time, most guys, let's just be honest, are not going to stay single for the rest of their lives, right? So what could she have done instead? She could have, obviously she doesn't have the right to say you can never remarry, right? That's probably not going to work out for her too well. But we'll talk about what she could have put into place. Starting with, what about a trust, right? If the stepmother had, even if she had offed her husband, right, she still would not have had control of Snow White's inheritance if there had been a trust in place. You see where I'm getting at with this, right? Also, what about a named regent or trustee, especially one who was required by law to act in Snow White's best interests? Again, think about this for a second. We can't tell him not to remarry, and we can't stop him from leaving his money to his new wife, right? But we could have, by putting a trust in place and naming a regent, right, for the kingdom, she could have at least protected her maternal inheritance, right, for her daughter Snow White. And then, of course, let's talk about life insurance. Now, I don't know if the kingdoms like back in the day had life insurance, but we certainly do today, right? So the real consequences of not having life insurance, what were the consequences for Snow White? When she finally did escape the toxic situation and got outside of the castle, she was completely penniless, and she ended up having to live with 7 really strange men just as a way to like keep a roof over her head in the short term, right? And she also ended up marrying a man she'd only met once, all in an attempt to escape this toxic situation that was left for her because she didn't have life insurance, she didn't have a trust, and there was no regent or trustee assigned who was legally required to act in her best interests. So let's talk about what an estate plan could have fixed for poor little Snow White. First of all, her mother could have created a revocable living trust. Instead of leaving the kingdom directly to her child, or in your case, right, instead of leaving your kingdom directly to your minor child, or even, right, we have to think about the fact that if your husband were to remarry immediately, what could be the impact on your child, right? He remarried a witch before she was even interred, so clearly he wasn't that grief-stricken. But let's just say in your relationship right now, what would happen if your spouse remarried immediately after you passed away? How is that going to affect your minor child if you left all the money to them, right? So one of the things you can do is work with an estate attorney. I highly recommend Destiny Bounds, who's in the chat with us today, so say hi to her. And this attorney can actually help you to place your assets into something like possibly a trust, right? I can't recommend that to you. You should ask Destiny if it would be a good fit for you. But the advantage to that would be it allows you to choose who manages it. Right? So ideally, you would have someone who is not grief-stricken or does not have a vested interest in that money be in control of your minor child's money, at least until they were old enough to actually retain control themselves, right? What's another thing you could do? You could appoint a financial guardian, or in Snow's case, a regent, to manage her kingdom until she came of age, right? Again, we want to focus on finding someone who has a legal fiduciary responsibility to manage your child's estate. Preferably not just like a second cousin or something, right? Like in our book that Destiny and I wrote together, From Hustler to Investor, we talk about like, don't do business with people you trust. Do business with people and put the legal protections in place so that you can trust them, right? Because when we rely purely on, oh, that person's a good person and they would never hurt me, or oh, that person's a good person, they would never hurt my child, we're putting a lot of trust into somebody. Whereas if we just went, you know what, I trust you completely, but I'm still going to put a legal document in place that just puts some boundaries around things, that's when we actually can trust that person, right? That is how we prevent evil random step witches. Okay. So then what's another thing we could have done? We could also have set up that life insurance policy, or even the trust, if that had been created, to do what we call age-based distribution rules. So what that means is, think about your child. Like, for anyone who's got kids who are no longer minors, think back to when your child turned 18. They did not magically suddenly become highly responsible with money, right? So even after 18, most kids probably shouldn't suddenly receive, 6 or 7 figure payout the day they turn 18. So often what we will recommend is staggering those payouts. Like maybe they get 10% of their inheritance at 21 and then 40% when they turn 30, et cetera, right? So your child doesn't end up blowing their inheritance on poison apples or marrying some smooth talker that they only kissed once, right? Now, the other thing, like I said, that Snow White's mom absolutely should have done is she should have had life insurance in place. Not because Snow White wasn't wealthy, right? Notice this, it's not how much money you have that determines whether or not you need insurance. For one thing, this is a great way to transfer wealth in a completely tax-free way, which there is no other option for that, right? Anything you leave your child is going to have tax consequences on your child. But when we put some money into a life insurance policy, they get that money tax-free. But in addition to that, oftentimes people underestimate how expensive it is actually to pass away, because there are things like estate taxes that have to be paid. There are often like burial costs, etc., right? And ruling a kingdom isn't cheap. So also, Snow, she's used to a certain lifestyle. She needs her glass slippers and her enchanted tutors and her dragon slaying entertainment, right? So just making sure that she had everything in place would have made it so that even if she was still in a toxic situation where her step witch of a stepmother, right, still did off her father and suddenly had control of the kingdom, she still would have had her own separate money that was completely tax-free and untouchable by the stepmom that she could have used to get out of that toxic situation without going to live with 7 strange men. Okay. All right. You guys ready to talk about the next one? Let's take a look at Cinderella. So Cinderella's mom, what was her biggest mistake? She made a lot of similar mistakes to Snow White's mom, but there were some significant differences on how we could have set things up here. So let's take a look. First of all, the biggest problem that they had there was a blended family, right? It wasn't just her father remarrying. Her father did remarry, but from everything we understand about the, Brothers Grimm's version as well as the Disney version, it does seem like he genuinely grieved and he really waited a long time before he finally decided to bring another woman into their family, right? And the biggest problem we have is that when he did end up bringing another woman into his life, he blended their 2 families together. So now she had these 2 stepsisters, and her father kept saying, right, like, well, be nice to them, be nice to them, be nice to them. And remember, Cinderella was actually not a princess, right? She was nobility. She was of noble blood, but she was not royalty. And so her father, when he passed away, he was only a baron, right, which was actually not a super high rank. And so she didn't really have anybody rooting for her, right? So if you think about it, what did Ella's mom really do? Where was her biggest mistake? Her biggest mistake wasn't just that she forgot to plan for herself, right? She doesn't seem to have had a will. She doesn't seem to have set anything up to pass directly to Cinderella, right? Seems like it was her biggest mistake. But the biggest mistake was actually that she forgot to plan what would happen if she died and then her husband does too. Because remember, at least in some of the versions, right, if you watch like Ella Enchanted and like there's all these different Cinderella versions, right? But in some of the versions, she actually did leave Cinderella some things. She left her a gown that Cinderella loved so much that ended up being turned into the ball gown she went to the ball in, right? She left her some shoes. She left her all kinds of things depending on the movie we watch, right? But the problem was she did not account for the fact that there might be a blended family after she was gone. And oftentimes we see this in real life where blended families or second marriages and step-siblings can make things really, really messy if we haven't put clear guardrails in place. So again, I really wanted to be able to bring Destiny on for this part, but it was totally my fault that I was not able to figure out the technology of how to do that. So I apologize, you guys. But we're going to cover just a couple of light things here, and then I do recommend that you jump on a call with Destiny. She actually was super kind and put her scheduling link in the chat. So please cheer her on and let her know you guys are watching. I'm literally getting, Destiny, you're going to laugh, but I'm literally getting nudged by Facebook to bring everybody on except you. That's so dumb. Like, I have an invite to invite Sheila on. I have an invite to invite Brenda on. I have an invite to literally invite everybody but you, which is so annoying right now. Yeah, technology. Okay, so let's dive into some of the things that Cinderella's mom could have done differently that would have hopefully prevented her from ever having that nickname in the first place. So first of all, again, just like Snow White's mom, she doesn't seem to have had a trust. And the biggest problem with not setting up a trust is you end up with little or no control over what happens after you're gone, right? Once someone else has inherited your money, there are a few exceptions, but most of the time it's theirs at that point, and they're going to do whatever the heck they want to do with it, right? So if you haven't actually worked with an attorney to set up ground rules ahead of time, whether it's in a trust or outside of it, you really have very little control over the outcome. And when your kids are involved, that can be a really big deal, right? So what could she have done? Well, she could have made it so that the stepmother was legally incapable of inheriting their home if she was on the title, right? Her own assets, anything that was passing down from hers that was personally hers, and of course, the power of the household. Also, we have things that are called asset carve-outs, and that's something you might want to research or, again, speak with your attorney about, because it was possible that maybe a lot of what they had together, Cinderella's mom and her dad, maybe a lot of what they had was owned jointly, but some of those things actually came probably from her maternal line, right? She was a nobility, which means that her family had title of its own and probably had wealth of its own that would have been part of her dowry and passed on, right? And again, I'm getting into like medieval law, which nobody's really that interested in, but me probably. But Cinderella was probably at that time legally allowed to inherit things through her maternal line if her mother had set it up properly, right? So we call those asset carve-outs, and again, it's something you should talk to your attorney about. And then lastly, just having a backup plan. Like, hey, a lot of moms I have spoken to do think about these sometimes, right? They think about like, gosh, what would happen to my kids if something happened to me? But they always say like, well, their dad would take care of them. But not always, right? Look what happened. He remarried, and again, his wife seems to have offed him. In some of the movies, he just had a heart attack, and that's sad enough, right? But in some of the movies, he was murdered by his new wife. So again, like, you don't know what's going to happen, and it's much, much better to have something in writing and have put things in place just in case. So unfortunately, if this situation occurred today, the likelihood is that the biological kids, in this case Ella of Cinderella, could have actually been disinherited without anyone breaking a single law, right? Simply by the fact that the only remaining adult is the stepmom, right? So again, this is where you need to speak to an attorney and really understand what are the ramifications of having a blended family. If my child is left to be raised by the wife that my husband remarries after I'm gone, what would be the ramifications for that, right? Okay, so let's take a look at some of the tools that you might want to talk to your attorney about. First of all, revocable living trust. Again, we kind of talked about that, right? How can we make sure that we can leave something to our child without having to leave it through our husband or, you know, worst case scenario, the wicked witch of the West that they marry, right? Separate property instructions again, or trust carve-outs. Again, those are things to talk to your attorney about. Customary beneficiary designations. Again, this is something you would talk to me about if I was your insurance agent. If you have someone else as your insurance agent, definitely get them on the phone this week and talk to them, because we want to make sure that your life insurance, on your retirement accounts, on your bank accounts, that we have the correct beneficiary designation. So remember, a beneficiary is someone who's going to inherit your money or inherit your asset when you're no longer around. And we want to think about that and go, well, it can't be my minor child, so who is it going to be? to make sure it doesn't accidentally default to your spouse who quickly remarries, or worse, your ex, right? You never know. I've spoken to quite a few women who still have their ex on legal documents, on insurance policies, on all kinds of stuff, right? And that's just like not always the best situation. All right, the last thing, like I said, is really making sure you have that contingency plan for dual deaths, meaning not only you passing away, but then also your partner or your kids, baby dada, whoever that looks like for you. All right, let's do one more. This one's really fun. I like this one a lot. We're going to talk about Ariel's mom because she also made a pretty big mistake, but it's wildly different than the mistake that the earlier moms made because her husband did not remarry. Right? He's still alive in the story, but he still was making some pretty wild decisions that probably Ariel's mom would not have made if she was alive. So let's talk about that for a minute. What was her biggest mistake? I would say her biggest mistake was not realizing that combining grief, right, trauma, plus unlimited magical and political power probably equals parenting with a trident, right? So think about it for a second. Queen Athena and King Trident were deeply in love. If you watch the prequel, if you know anything about the story, they actually had a wonderful home life, right? And they had 7 daughters. And so when Queen Athena passed away, she not only left a traumatized husband, right, who suddenly finds himself solo parenting 7 teenage girls. He had no co-guardian, no trustee, no idea what to do with his emotions. And what did he do? He overreacts, he overparents, and he really pisses Ariel off a lot, right? But this is the crazy part about this story is that Trident isn't a toxic dad. He clearly dearly loves his daughters, right? And he would do anything for them. But he's got a little bit of a temper and he's a little bit overbearing and he's a king. He's used to getting his own way, right? And so because he had no support while he was grieving and the burden of an entire kingdom on his shoulders, sometimes being a really good dad kind of took a back seat for him, right? And so instead of like thoughtful leadership of his daughters, and we got these like crazy curfews, surveillance, right? Imagine putting a private eye on your 16-year-old daughter. Like, whoa, what a decision, right? And all these crazy like magical sanctions. And Ariel was very independent. And so what happened? Well, she ran straight into the arms of a man she barely knew, right? She'd seen him one time dancing on the deck of a ship, and that was it. That's all she needed, right? She signed a highly sketchy magical contract and then literally gave up her voice in order to escape her father. Now, that's definitely like a little bit of teenage drama right there, but think about it. If you weren't around and you have multiple kids, or maybe you also have a business that you co-run with your husband, right? If something happened to you and he was grieving, how well do you think he's going to parent on his own, right? With no backup plan, no life insurance, no nothing. So let's take a look at real life and kind of what this looks like. And again, I sadly have seen scenarios similar to this, right? No support for the surviving parent. I see that again and again and again. That's the unfortunate thing about selling life insurance, is that unfortunately I'm the one people call in those scenarios, and I have seen how hard it can be on the surviving parent, right? Even with a life insurance payout in place, it could still hard, right? But if he had that, think about what Triton could have done. He could have taken some time away from the throne, right? Brought in some help to manage the kingdom. Instead, what happened? He clamped down on his daughters with rules and rage. Probably not the best parenting choice, right? Okay, what else? No backup advisor or guardian. So Queen Athena was co-ruler, right? She wasn't just his consort. She was co-ruler of their kingdom. And so her passing away with nobody named to, as a backup advisor for him or some kind of regent or something so he could step away, that was probably not the smartest move, right? But of course she didn't do it on purpose. Her passing was unexpected, like so many women's are. But that's why it's important for us to plan ahead. So again, she had no plan for Ariel's future as well. Now I know that she loved her daughters. If you watch the prequel, you can see how much she absolutely took the time to really know all of her 7 daughters, right? But if you think about it, Ariel clearly had a knack for retail, but there was no pathway for that after her mom died, right? And her father just did not understand that. So her Athena, knowing that her daughter has this ambition, could have put plans in place ahead of time if she had thought about it. So let's take a look at some of the things that estate plan could have fixed in this situation. First of all, there is what we call a testamentary trust, which is basically, again, speak to your attorney about this, but think of it as like instructions that you can put in your will to make sure that your partner understands what you would have wanted to have happen with your kids, right? So especially if you are a stay-at-home mom, or maybe you are separated right now, or maybe you're just the primary caregiver for the kids because your husband, is not as involved with the child rearing. Those are good examples of times when he might actually really appreciate a little bit of instruction from you. So think about that, like 5-page document that you type up for your babysitter every time they come over. Something like that could actually be attached or put inside of the documentation that your attorney can help you draw up, so that if something ever happened to you, he would have a little bit of help from beyond the grave, right? To know exactly what to do with his kids, right? You could also name a co-guardian or trustee. Again, not only a trustee in terms of the sense of having a living trust to take care of all of the financial decisions, right? But also naming a co-guardian helps your spouse to have someone to lean on in those situations. We all know, right, that having a dual parent household is much easier, not only for financial reasons, but also because of decision fatigue, right? And imagine 7 teenage girls all asking you to make decisions constantly. That was probably pretty exhausting. So just having a trusted co-decision maker to support Triton could have actually brought a lot of balance and logic, and maybe possibly a maternal figure for the girls when they needed it the most, right? Now there's also another option, which is what we call a parenting letter of intent. I've seen these before, and again, they're not legally binding, but they're just instruction manual, right? Especially about things like spiritual beliefs, emotional needs, cultural values, parenting philosophies. Think again that 5 or 10 page document you always give your babysitter, right? It's similar to that of like, hey, if these scenarios came up, right? Especially if neither one of you or your partner, have ever raised a child to the age of 18, maybe you got 2 or 3 kids and they're all still under the age of 10. There are a lot of scenarios that have just never come up in conversation yet, possibly, right? And it's important for your spouse to know what you would have wanted in those moments, right? So again, these are the kinds of things that people don't often think about when they think of estate planning, but they could actually make the entire situation so much more livable for everybody you leave behind. And then lastly, of course, my favorite, which is, again, life insurance. We often think, again, well, they're super wealthy, they don't need life insurance, but nothing could be further from the truth. Because oftentimes the super wealthy, as I have noticed with my own high net worth clients, they oftentimes have very little cash available. A lot of their assets tend to be tied up, right? And so the last thing you want is for a person you love to have to sell a highly valuable asset at possibly even a loss, or at a time when the market is just not really ready for that sale, just because they have to liquidate something quickly because you passed away at the wrong moment, right? So life insurance, more than anything else, it gives you liquidity. If you're high net worth, or if you are very wealthy, or your family is very used to a certain lifestyle, life insurance is a great way to transfer wealth from generation to next without it being super expensive for you. So again, what's the real mom takeaway here? Your partner might survive you, right? Probably in a lot of situations, if something happens to you unexpectedly, probably your partner is going to survive you. But that doesn't mean that they're not going to remarry. That doesn't mean that your child might not be growing up in a blended family. You don't actually know or have really any control over what he does next, right? So when we can actually put these kinds of things in place, you make a different choice than Queen Athena did, right? A plan that actually supports your co-parent and protects your daughter from danger of being a child labor like Cinderella, or finding herself in a weird situation of having to live with 7 bachelors like Snow White, right? Or whatever other odd situations that people get themselves into, like a child who has to trade her voice to a sea witch just to feel understood, right? The reason these Disney princesses grew up the way they did wasn't because of magic. Magic was the intervention because of the negative consequences that were left behind by these moms. No will, no trust, no guardian, no instructions, no life insurance. And at the end of the day, it's not you who will pay the price, it's actually your kids. So I hope that this has been fun for you guys, but I also really want you to take a serious look at everything you have in place right now, because no matter whether your kingdom is a castle, I hope it is for your sake, or just, a small cozy little apartment with just you and your kids and your husband, right? Your child actually really does deserve your protection, and it's often not very expensive to get these pieces in place, especially because Destiny is fantastic at staggering it so that the most important documents are put in place first, and then over time we can make it more elaborate if we need to, right? But I really want to stress this because I don't know about you guys, but I get really tired of seeing all the super sad GoFundMe posts on social media or headline news of families that were just not prepared. And it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't matter how much money you make. You can afford to put some kind of estate plan in place for your kids and then grow it over time until it really protects them from every angle. So please do, let's decide today we're going to rewrite the story. No more Disney moms, okay? And your challenge for this week is to pick just one of the strategies that we talked about today and start taking action. I recommend, like I said, that you reached out to Destiny as your first step and get some information for her. If you do not have life insurance, please reach out to me. I am absolutely happy to jump on a free call and get you a great quote, shop you around to a number of different brands, you might say, of life insurance. We have lots of companies that we work with. So comment the word estate below if you want help, and I'll direct you to either myself or Destiny to get you started, all right? Thanks again, guys. We'll talk soon.